Okay, we are live.
Yay.
Yay, so I'd like to introduce you guys to Maggie Patterson. She's a communications strategist, aka professional storyteller. She's been in business for, 15 years, helping small businesses define and tell their stories better. So we hear it all the time in marketing. You have to tell your story. What does that actually mean? Where do you start? And how do you tell a story people actually want to hear? So tell me a little bit about you, Maggie, maybe about your path and kind of how you got to being a communication strategist and how storytelling became something that's such a big part of your message.
So I have had a very traditional, I went to school, I checked the boxes like I'm sure most of us do, right? You do all the things you're supposed to do, but I always had this little voice in me that was like, you're going to be self-employed. You don't want to work for the man. So literally, like when I started off in my career, like I always was looking for the opportunity that could like train me in the type of training that I knew eventually if I wanted to be self-employed or run my own agency or whatever it was, that I would do that. So when I came out of college with my PR certificate, professional PR certificate, I was like, okay, so what's the hardest thing you can do? Oh, I'm going to go work in a PR agency and be a slave for 5 years. And that's essentially what I did. And I mean, I got amazing, amazing, amazing training, which I like to be really transparent with people about that because I learned the business of the business, not just the functional skills to do communications. So I started off my business when I decided I was going to quit and never come back from my year-long maternity leave with no plan. I decided, hey, I'm going to go into business doing what I already do. I already know how to manage accounts, people, all those things. So I'm like, I knew how to do new business. That was a big part of my job. So I'm like, no problem. And it actually turned out to be no problem. I had a very, very solid business for quite a long time. And then I got bored. And now here I am today, kind of reinvented my business about 18 months to a year ago, and now working mainly with online entrepreneurs. And really the storytelling comes from anytime I would sit down to do a PR campaign, anytime I sit down to write copy, what does it all come down to? The message. We don't know what we're saying. We have a really hard time figuring out everything else. And as a designer, you know that. Like if your client doesn't know what they're doing or what they're trying to communicate, it's really hard for you to come up with a visual concept that's going to work.
And even if they don't have their content ready, which is something every single designer struggles with, is the client's just like, oh, put the mock-ups together and I'll pass you the content later. And it's really, really hard to come up with what those visuals look like without that messaging for sure.
Yeah, you need a bucket, right? You need somewhere to start. And I always like explain to my clients is, messaging, storytelling, whatever you want to call it, it's that foundation for your house. If you don't have concrete under your house, if you don't have blocks or whatever it is, all those other stories you build, the web design, the copy, the publicity, the social media, it's all going to be a little bit off. And that's where I think if you're watching other brands out there, especially with small businesses, personal brands, that's where we get this kind of dissonance where you go, wait a second.
Something feels off.
Yeah, something feels off. Or like you feel like every time you look at someone, they're changing their, they're basically changing it. You're like, what are they doing? I don't understand. And the last thing any of us can afford to do is have our audience be confused. If they're confused, they can't buy from us.
Absolutely. And so you talk a little bit about the sort of science behind storytelling. So, what is it that happens in our brains? Like, why are humans so drawn to story? What is it about story?
Well, what's the easiest way to explain story is like when we hear a factual argument, two parts of our brains are activated. And I won't get into like the actual parts because that's just beyond nerdy. But when we actually hear a story, it's a pattern our brain is trained to recognize. So when we're kids, we learn a bunch of things. We learn patterns of the alphabet. We learn the pattern of shapes, different types of sounds, all these cues. Story is another one we actually learn. And it's actually just like, it's one of those things, it's like hardwired into us. We don't even know it's happening. So when we hear a story, what naturally happens is we go, wait a second, this might be more interesting. Okay. And if you think if you're sitting in a presentation or you're listening to a podcast, that's the stuff you actually key more into. You're like, oh, wait a second, this is more relatable. And the reason is it supplants logic in your brain and all these other centers of your brain start. So if someone's talking about the smell of chocolate chip cookies, you can smell the chocolate chip cookies. And when you start to have those types of sensory and emotional reactions, it actually becomes implanted in our brain such a way that we've now had an experience, and when we've had an experience, we start to have a positive association. So all of a sudden, all these weird things have started happening in the brain because you've told one story. versus if I tried to argue it out of facts, I might never get through to you.
Very cool. And I'm curious how, for example, graphic designers can begin to tell their story in a way that's not just an about page with a dump of, I went to this school and I like cats and coffee. Like, how can designers begin to actually tell a story? What does it mean to tell their story?
So I think for designers, I mean, you have it is just a different type of storytelling in so many ways, because here's the biggest, most basic story you can tell is, what is your approach to, how is your approach to design different? You know, what is your aesthetic? What is your vibe? Every designer I know has a different look, feel, approach, system, process. So starting to tell that story versus like, hey, I really like cats and chinchillas, is way more interesting to me as a client. So you always want to be answering for your client kind of the what's in it for me with your story. And I think as a designer, you know, showcasing your work, making sure your portfolio is not only solid, but makes a lot of sense in terms of what you're showing. Communicating what your client process is, that's a story in your business. Communicating the successes your clients have once you've redone their visual identity. And this is something I see with designers all the time. They don't do. They don't talk about how what they do improves the business. And I think the problem is we go, well, there's the copy, and then there was this, and there's that. Yeah, no, but the design is a contributing factor to that. So take some credit for that.
Oh, yeah.
If all of a sudden Marie designs a website for me, and I'm converting 10% higher in my sales, the design clearly had an impact, and that's a story you need to tell. So don't shy away from talking about like the actual successful results, because results are what people look for when they're going to hire you. So the story of how you work with your clients, how you can showcase the work you're doing with clients, that's probably the most compelling story a designer can tell. And I don't know that a lot of designers are doing that really well.
Mm. And I think that's also why I encourage so many designers to use case studies instead of just showing thumbnail photos of what they've done, right? Because then you're just saying, you're hiring me just for the aesthetics. I've given no indication that there's a thought process behind why I chose these aesthetics and that sort of thing.
Exactly. Like, how did we get from point A to point B? Like, you know, there's nothing more compelling in any industry than behind the scenes. So when you announce a new client project, instead of just saying, new look for so-and-so, talk to me about how you got to it. Give us the inside track.
Oh, I love that, yeah.
People want to know, like, that's the stuff I'm really interested in business. Anyone who can kind of show me the behind the scenes, they have me hook, line, and sinker every single time.
I think everybody that I talk to can admit that they just want to know how people do it. You just want to see, like, what does their process look like? How many mock-ups do you show your client? Like, you know, we all want to know what other people's process looks like.
And, you know, if you notice your clients, like, you have every time you're doing a new call with a new client, and they all have the same questions, that's all tips for stories. Like, almost every single one of my clients asks the same questions. So now that's in my copy, that's in my sales page, that's something I talk about. Like, I talk about the storytelling process as a shortcut to me being able to get my clients into the door faster and understand where I'm coming from. They don't have as many questions about the process because they know why we're doing it.
And do you find listening to those questions that people keep asking you over and over again, does that also help you create new products? Like, have you said, oh, clearly I'm going to need to create a storytelling, you know, offering based on what people are asking for?
Totally. So here's a great example is one of the things I noticed in the storytelling process, and I mean, I've been working with this for a long time, is that in the entrepreneurial market, people don't understand how to do more with their customers and tell a story about their customers more than showing a portfolio or a quote. So I was like, what can I do about that? And I created just a small kind of micro, minimally viable product called the Client Brewery. It essentially walks you through everything from how to get your testimonials, what type of questions to ask, how do you interview people, you know, how do you create a referral process in your business? Like, really core business fundamentals that I've always done with big companies. I've always done in my own business. I mean, people are like, oh, this is so simple. Why didn't I do this? You know, what kind of thank you gift do I send? So I just put it all in one neat package, and that was really from people, the repetitive questions of like, I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to do this. You know, listening in groups, watching my own clients struggle with it. I'm like, because it's so much easier for us to take something we already have and just improve it versus, so if you have a happy client, and it's true for designers, much easier to have a happy client and keep working with them than to go out and find another one. So that was really kind of the gist of that. Just a really simple stuff that we think everyone else knows, but they don't.
Love that. Yeah, you got to do, my friend Amanda says, follow what's easy, right? You follow where the ease is.
Yeah, and to me it seemed too easy, but I was like, I did well with that product, so.
It's tough when we take for granted what we know and what comes so second nature to us, so we kind of, yeah, it's the curse of the expert, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I know obviously you do stuff with PR then, and so what I know a lot of designers struggle with, and even I struggle with this myself, is blogging. I'm sure this is a topic that comes up a lot for you. Yeah. So how do people weave their own stories into their blog posts? A lot of people struggle with, well, I don't know what to talk about. Am I talking to my clients or am I talking to, designer colleagues? So that's one thing I know a lot of designers struggle with. I'd be curious if you have any thoughts on even whether it's reaching out to guest posting and kind of people wanting to grow their presence, but they're struggling with where their audience is.
So I think the biggest thing is, like, you need to, the whole eyes on your own paper, and I'm sure, Marie, you talk about this, is, I think it's really great to learn from your peers, but the purpose of your blog isn't to make you look good to your peers. It's not to entertain them or give them something to read on Thursday morning. The real purpose of your blog is to connect with people who are following you, to get them along this trust continuum. So if you're not really serving your audience and what they need to know from you, you're going to have a problem. Now, when it comes to actually, what do I blog about? Going back to those questions we talked about, that's a really good place to start. Like, I noticed a couple weeks ago, I had a lot of clients asking me about social proof. How do I use social proof? And I was like, oh, thank you. Blog post idea. Done. I'll write 2. I can direct you to this. I can answer questions with this. And the challenge with how do you weave a story into a blog post, you've only got this much room in the blog post, and your story might be 3/4 of it if you let it. So I really encourage people to use what's called a micro story. Think of just like small kind of slices. We're trained, if we look at what goes on in the entrepreneur community, we're kind of trained to expect we have to tell these epic stories. The story of I quit my job and I was living on a couch. And you know what? Not every story has to be the triumph over adversity. Maybe it could be like, hey, I was at the hairdresser the other day and I know this is something I noticed, I'm going to blog about. I noticed all the hairdressers had ponytails and it wasn't a good commercial for their business. So how are you messing with those little tiny things that people can relate to on a day-to-day basis, I think in a lot of ways, when you take those as a group, are way more compelling than the big sad story of your life. People don't want to know your sad story. They really don't. They care about what you're going to tell me. How is this going to help me? So your stories need to come through that lens.
That's so funny. And I've definitely noticed being willing to be a little more vulnerable has definitely
yeah.
It resonates with people, and I don't know if you think that, is that in any industry, not just as a designer, but do you find that in your own industry, like being willing to admit when, hey, I wasn't really sure how to figure out this problem, or boy, I really messed up that job, here's what I learned from it.
Yeah, I think that there's a time and a place for vulnerability. I think the problem is vulnerability, just like authenticity. For designers, for copywriters, for any kind of service provider, it's kind of in this, it can go too far. So if you're going to tell a story about that, really focus on the lesson. Be thoughtful about not showing something that is going to make you look bad.
Unprofessional, yeah.
Yeah, unprofessional. And I think if you kind of run it through that lens is like, well, would I do business with me if I told you this? Yikes, maybe not. Sometimes you need to leave some space between when something happened. You have a bad client situation. Don't blog about it next week. That's a bad idea. Because your client's going to know. And here's the thing is it's just a really fine line, and everyone's going to have a different comfort level with it. Understand the difference between being vulnerable and casting yourself as a victim. I think it's very easy to cross over. If every single blog post you have, if every single story you tell is always from this vulnerable thing, you're probably taking a left turn or right turn off into the wrong territory. And looking like a victim does not make people want to trust you or do business with you. It makes you look flaky. You know, if you've had more than one post about how you were crying on the floor, I don't want to do business with you. You get to cry on the floor once. And I'm a little bit hardcore. Like, I'm not really a soft woo-woo kind, if you haven't figured that out. But, yeah, more than one thing about that, I'm like, oh, are you going to be crying on the floor during my project?
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't want to give you $6,000. Sorry.
No, absolutely, totally agree with that. And I remember before we went live, we were talking about bridging the different pieces. So the fact that your story, for example, is not just what people see on your about page or your website, right? There's so many different pieces that your story is. I'm sure it's the way you speak on social media, the way you write about yourself, the kinds of projects that you take on. It's a little bit of everything. It's also partly what other people say about you. So how does somebody describe you? Like, oh, you got to hire, you know, Sarah. She's totally nails this part of the process, right? So how can we make sure that even kind of beyond our words on our site, that we are bridging all those gaps, and that there's like a solid story that's being told about us? What sorts of things can people do to make sure they're telling the right story and bridging the gaps?
So I think that, you know, that I love the fact that you brought up, like, there's basically our story is all those disparate pieces. It's everything from the design we have right through to, you know, what profile picture we look at, what thing we put up on Facebook, what weird thing we put up on Facebook on our business page. All those little bits are showing our personality, right? Like, I love celebrity gossip, and finally someone said to me last week, they're like, why don't you ever talk about celebrity gossip in your professional stuff? I mean, it's related to what you do in a lot of ways. And I'm like, I hadn't thought of it that way. You know, how can you bring all those little pieces together that fit? So I think there's a couple ways, if you kind of struggle with it, is the most basic thing is nail that cocktail pitch. That one or two lines, what it is you do and who you serve. Until you can articulate that, you can't expect your clients to refer you and know what you know. Well, she kind of did this for me, but I think she might do a little bit of this. And that's why, like, you know, Marie is a digital strategist. Like, you know it. What is the thing you are? Are you a designer? Are you a developer? Be very specific. And who do you actually serve? Do you serve female entrepreneurs? Do you serve micro businesses in your local city in Indiana? Like, being very specific in that one or two lines, who you are, what you do, and how you do it, that's what really matters more than anything else. Because you can always go back to that and be like, oh, why am I talking about pina coladas? This doesn't make sense.
I love that. And that's something I wanted to ask you about too, is how niche you need to get with your with who you serve. Because I know a lot of newer designers, for example, they're like, I don't really know who my audience is yet. Like, do I need to decide that I only work with small business owners? And I think life and marketing gets so much easier when you do get really specific. So, you know, I'd love to hear your input on how soon does somebody need to pick their niche, and is it important to, you know, really limit your audience or really limit the type of work you do in the beginning when you are maybe just kind of figuring that stuff out?
So I think that there's something to be said for a little bit of trial and error in the beginning, you know, that I was called the test and correct phase. At the same time, though, like, you need to really look at how you like to work. So let's say you're the type of person who really wants to be on the phone with your clients a lot, and you want to be working in a certain way. Well, you're going to need to build a story and attract people who are going to work in that model. A good example is, I have a couple friends who are designers, and one of them loves working with coaches, loves that really high touch. The other would, like, poke her eyes out because coaches tend to want to be on the phone. And so get really clear on kind of how you like to work first. If you're super introverted and being on the phone all the time is just going to be too much for you, or you don't want to spend a lot of time in a certain part of the design process because it's not really your flow, get clear on those things and then build from there. Because you're doing work you hate and that sucks your soul out every day, there's always going to be a little bit of that in the beginning, but kind of minimize it. And then I think over time, niche down. Like, I know in my business, like, I really like to work with people who have this type of business, tend to be making this much money. You know, knowing that kind of stuff lets you write to that audience, lets you create a visual presence that communicates with that audience. Trying to be everything to everyone.
Recipe for disaster.
Yeah, it's honestly, from a communication standpoint, recipe for so much extra stress. Like, perfect example is in my blog posts, I swear. So I'm probably not going to have a lot of corporate clients who can handle that. And I'm okay with that. But the corporate clients I do have that work with it get that I'm not going to do that in their blog posts. So we're fine. But, you know, there's an element in your story you want to screen people out of your business.
I love that. Yeah, your story screens people out.
Yeah, I call it the repelling. You know, how do we repel people out of my business? I don't want them to work with me. We're not going to be a good fit.
Yeah, I love that idea that you're like the story is the filter that kind of says, you want to, you know, a small quickie job. I'm not that person because it's pretty much right there on my page. I've already said I don't do quickie jobs. I don't do this. Projects start at this price point. Ooh, okay. I already know that I'm dealing with people at a certain probably level of success, level of experience. So all of those factors start to kind of weed the right people out, right?
And it's, you know, the biggest thing you can do is be clear.
Be clear.
Be clear in your communications. I think we get so stuck in trying to be cute or quippy or clever, and then we're not clear. We try to be like, you know, create this pricing model that's like, look at me, I'm so clever and innovative. It's like, no, prices start at $6,500 is what I really want to know. Because if you're not clear, you're making it complex for your people, and people do not have time for complexity. And that's from your design right through to the words, right through to what you're putting on social media. If it takes me too long to understand it, I'm clicking away.
And something that you just said reminded me of the idea of using internal versus external language. So the language that you would use to describe what you do versus the language that your clients understand, and how important it is to, for example, a lot of designers that also do their own development, I think, get really into the technical side of what they're doing.
Yes.
Where that's fine and dandy that you're doing like a responsive layout and this and that, but is that really the language that your clients are using? And so I'm sure you have some opinions on how important it is to be listening to the language that they're actually using and using that in your own copy.
Yeah, and it's, you know, I always call it the jargon filter. So I worked with software companies for a long time, a lot of them being internet security software companies. So, I mean, the jargon, the expert encryption, and they're all speaking the same. And I'm like, I don't actually think your clients know that. They just want to know they wouldn't want to be hacked. So, like, boil it down for your clients. Like, I don't care if you're scripting in Java or I don't care what you're doing. What is this? What is this benefit to me? What's in it for me at the end of the day? What does this mean? It means my website's going to be faster. Yes, do it. And so kind of run it through the jargon. Like, if you can't explain it to your partner who's not technical, or your 10-year-old or grandma, like, it's probably not the best language to use.
I love it, the jargon filter. And another question I have is whether or not, I mean, I think everybody needs to learn how to write better. Like, I think regardless of even what your job is, we can all learn we should be learning how to write better, because our ability to communicate the, you know, point A to point B that we've taken our client through, like everything about what we say we do, we need to find the words effectively to say that, right? So
yeah.
I was going to ask whether or not you thought designers should be hiring and working with copywriters and collaborating with copywriters, or can everyone take some steps to learn how to write better, so that this is something that you can do in, you know, every time you add a new portfolio piece, you know how to write that. So what are some tips that you would have for either helping designers write better, or are there resources you could point them to say, like, if this is something you're interested in, definitely be visiting these websites?
So a lot of people who do copywriting take the hard line, like, oh, you absolutely have to hire a copywriter. Let's face it. It's like design. It's not necessarily, unless you have a certain level of business, you're never going to be in the position to have someone else write everything else. Just like I might have to, even though I have a designer, I might have to create something in Canva. It happens, right? So if you can't learn those basic skills, you're going to have a problem. I think the biggest thing, if you want to start writing your own copy, whether it be blog posts or whatever, is just really always be clear on the goal of what you're trying to achieve. I think the biggest example is when people do their own website copy. Well, what is the goal of the About page? What is the goal of your services page? What action do you want people to take? You can't write copy until you have a really clear picture of those things and answer those questions. So that's probably the best place. I mean, and there's so much good free copywriting content. Copy Blogger, Pro Blogger, like, don't think those are just for professional writers. There's Read any copywriter's blog. There's tons and tons of podcasts and everything. I mean, if you really wanted to like start improving, there's the other thing is too, like if you really want to kind of master copywriting, hire a really good editor. There's lots of people who do copy editing and will show you like where you're going wrong. There's lots of people who copywriters who will co-write with you. So if you actually want to improve and like work with them and collaborate with them on a process, I would encourage you to do that. I mean, I work with an editor on my own stuff, and I always am like, really? That was a dumb grammar mistake. But even a copywriter has a copy editor. So, you know, if you need to work with someone to help you kind of improve over time, I think that that's a really good, solid investment if you don't want to be hiring a copywriter to write every single word coming out of your mouth.
Very cool. And I'd love to know just a little bit more about your specific process. So when you're working with someone and they're saying, okay, help, I've got this new website I'm going to be launching, like I need help telling my story, where do you start? You know, do you have this massive questionnaire that you bring people through? Like how do you pull somebody else's story? I'm sure it's a beastly process.
Oh, it's a big process. Okay, so for copy, I mean, when I'm doing, let's say, website copy,
yeah.
The biggest, I mean, I have a signature process called the story distillery, and it really comes down to 4 parts. And so if you want to do better storytelling, these are the 4 parts I always tell people you need to master. The customer story, the story of what your customer wants to hear. What are they struggling with? What kind of language do they use? Really kind of getting into their head, and not in like this, they read Cosmo on Sunday mornings while they drink lattes type of way. Like getting down to like, what's gonna be the difference between them investing in you and someone else? Understanding where you fit in the conversations in your competitive landscape. So really looking at that part. The next part, we really look at their personal story. Do they have an interesting backstory? What's the experiences we have there? And a great example of this is my friend Megan Flatt. We did this, and she was like, I don't understand how this part connects to this part. And I was like, oh, it's this. So, you know, really kind of working on the bridge between what you've always done, how you got here, why your experience, how does this all fit together in a way that makes sense? Because you never want someone to look at you and go, huh, are they actually qualified? You want, how do we communicate in a way that's not boring about that, you know, who it is you serve, all that. The third part is really that credibility part, and this is what, you know, turning the customer into the hero. How do you do what you do better than anyone else? What's different about you? Why do customers love you? The case studies, the portfolio, all that kind of stuff. And then really the last part, and this is kind of, I think, the secret sauce of storytelling, is the willingness to be a bit bold and brazen. It's, you know, taking a stand on things. And this is so hard, I think, when you're someone who's tends to hang back a little bit, or you're introverted. You don't necessarily want to show up and be like, hey, look at me. That's not what you have to do. I think it's just being really clear on your opinions. My approach to design is X. You're allowed to have that. I design on thesis because of X, or whatever it is. In my case, it's very much that, like, I don't believe there should be this one-size-fits-all approach to doing this. So how do you bring apart, how do you kind of tap into the story of your industry, of the trends and issues happening around you? That's really what being bold and brazen is. It doesn't mean you have to be out there with a big placard being like, I am the poster child for this. No, you just need to stand for something. Otherwise, you're a little bit wishy-washy. No one wants to do business with wishy-washy. So once we do the whole story distillery, then I go into a content strategy process where we plan a lot. We do, like, what are the goals for the pages, and what's the buyer's path to purchase, and then I'll finally write your copy. By the time I get to copy, my clients are always like, whatever you write's going to be fine because you've sucked out all my brain power and we've planned out everything.
I love that, and I'm curious how much of that process is collaborative, and is the client seeing you work through it, or is it sort of like you're going through this process, you're presenting, seeing how they react, you're going back to the drawing board?
So both, we do story to story and then we do the content strategy. It tends to be like I'm going to do some pre-work with them, then we have a call, and then I go away and put it all together. Story to story, we don't tend to do a lot of back and forth. When we get to content strategy, at that point, there's definitely some collaboration that goes on, and I think that at some point in your process, there's going to be that part where you need to go back and forth with your client. And content strategy is the critical part for me because yeah, their story is important, but if we don't have this idea of what we actually want people to do on your website, none of it's going to matter. We're going to end up with we're going to end up with a really pretty website that doesn't do anything otherwise.
It's funny that topic keeps coming up, like the start with the end in mind, be clear on the goal, and that's sort of like the basis of the first module in DSS is like, where do you actually want to be? What are we working towards? Because we can't really make tweaks in your business if we don't really know where do you want to be positioned, what kind of income do you want, what kind of clients do you want to collaborate with? So I love that.
Yeah. And I think that that's something for designers, like really getting your clients to understand that aesthetics are important, but if you actually want a business, it needs to be a little more than just attractive. Like, we need to have this in mind.
100%. I'd love to know some examples of people that you think do such a great job of telling stories. Maybe people that we can relate to in the entrepreneur universe, or maybe some smaller brands that do this really well.
Oh yeah, I have a couple really good ones. So you might be familiar with it, Marie, because you come from here. So where I live, Ottawa, Canada, right outside of an hour of the city, there's a brewery called Beau's Brewery. And it's a family-owned brewery, but they just do a really, their branding, their story, it's very, they are a microbrewery. They've won lots of awards, but I actually really, dig everything they do in marketing because it's not super flashy. They definitely have this, kind of retro aesthetic, and it really ties in that family thing, but everything is in this consistent voice. And I mean, they have now what they call the Beau's Army, and it's like the super fans, and that's what we did for Father's Day. We went to Beau's Brewery and did the tour and bought the beer and that's, they've gone from a very small startup brewery now to being very well known because of this really great storytelling around their brand. And I mean, they're not a huge operation, but they're doing amazing things because of it. So I love looking outside of our immediate vertex.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Another, this is crazy. So I'm a scrapbooker, and true confessions today. I'm a scrapbooker, and for years I followed this woman called Becky Higgins. And if anyone's a scrapbooker, they're like, yes, I know her. But she's such a great example of storytelling for two reasons. Because her brand started out with, she now teaches this very leading approach to scrapbooking, but it really started out with her wanting to tell her family's stories. So she then designed products and a product line, and now has an entire company, which is one of the biggest scrapbooking companies, that's based all around that. And again, everything they do, their approach to scrapbooking is about simplicity. Their web design is simple. The way they communicate is simple. There's never any complex language. Everything you do with them it's meant for very busy people. And I think that's part of the story, is how is the energy around your story amped up? Is it high energy? Is it, an example right now of energy around things is you watch the B-School launch going on. And this is not right or wrong, but there's a certain energy that goes into that B-School launch. And for some people, that's going to be yes, I want it. Other people, they're going to go, oh, I'm tired.
It's that time again, yeah.
Too many bright colors. So I think, part of your story is kind of the energy, the way you talk about it. I mean, my brand tends to be a little energetic and authoritative, but if you actually had beers with me, I would be probably energetic and authoritative. And then I would go back to my room and have to lie down for a few hours to recharge.
Do you consider yourself an introvert, Maggie?
Oh, completely.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It's my dirty little secret.
Yeah, I wouldn't have necessarily known that.
I always call it, the line I always use is, I'm extroverted by necessity.
Yeah.
Because I started working at a PR firm. I'm a good communicator, but it's hard. When you're introverted, it's hard. I would have to do these presentations, and I used to nearly pass out in speech class in college. So.
Wow.
Yeah. So to go from that to that, it goes to show I really wanted my career to succeed. So I learned the skills I need, and a lot of it's just performance.
I love that you brought that up, because when I moved to Vancouver from Toronto, I made it a mission of mine. I thought, I can't make more impact in my business unless I'm good with people. And I have to come out of my shell. I have to understand how to meet people, how to communicate with people, how to feel more comfortable around people. So it was a conscious effort on my part. I knew that if I wanted to scale my business, I was going to have to grow that side of things. So it's been sort of a personal mission to kind of that extroversion by necessity, and in a way that feels good too. Like I don't want to put on this face that doesn't feel right for me, but I wanted to build those skills better.
Yeah, I mean, my one friend refers to it as that's professional Maggie. Professional Maggie is a little more amped up than like having a cocktail Maggie maybe, or Friday night Maggie in her yoga pants.
And I'm curious about that then, because to some extent those personalities will be different, but obviously they still work together as part of your story. So are there people, maybe examples in branding, where that story is almost too dissonant, where you feel like that personal and professional face seem very, very different, and there's a disconnect there? Like, do you find that happens in?
There's no one I can really point to, but you know what? We know it when we see it. Or like when the external. This actually, you know what? This is, and I mean, I will never point out names for this because I just don't think that's kind. But you will see this. There's kind of this energy. I call it the try hard. There's this energy that comes through, whether it be like in a video or a blog post or a Facebook group, where you just feel like there's something, like that little gut feeling goes, this isn't right. And it's often because people are trying too hard. And especially, I see this a lot with people trying to be really badass. Like, oh, I'm such a badass. Look at me, I'm a rebel. And it's like, you're about as edgy as I am, and I'm not edgy at all. So, like, please sit down. And I think that reflects a lack of comfort of just being who you are. Like, I'm going to drop an F-bomb and then I'm going to go do a scrapbook. And I mean, I know that's probably a little bit messed up, but that's the way I am. So I think you just have to get really right with yourself and the way you want to function.
Love that. And I know we talked a bit about the idea of our own brands being always evolving, right? So I mean, we're going to go through different evolutions. We're going to kind of shift gears. And so I imagine our stories are never done. Like, they're always kind of evolving.
No, they're never done. Like, there's always going to be a piece that's unfinished. And I think that's why, like anything, you just need to start. Start, if you're looking, listening to this and you're like, oh my gosh, this seems like I have to do all this work on my story. No, you don't. Start with telling little stories, little things that give personality, little things that communicate who you are, what you're about, what's in it for your clients in little tiny ways. And those start to add up. It's like drops in a bucket. And eventually your bucket's full, and they're like, oh, I totally get the full picture of her.
And it takes time to do that, right? It takes time to fill the bucket. So I think people can't expect to just, I've rewritten my homepage copy, now I'm this person. But it does take time to build that with all the different disparate pieces, right?
Yeah, and I mean, a lot of times, this idea of the overnight success story. Like, there's no overnight success. Like, I had someone say to me about 6 months ago, she goes, you just came from nowhere. I'm like, over the last 9 years? I've had a business, like, there's been a lot of things that lead up. So you're just starting out, like, just kind of a little bit of discipline about being patient. I mean, it does take time. No one shows up right away and has a boom, even if it looks that way.
I love that you said that. It takes time. It takes time to build your story. It takes time to even, like, find your story, to craft it. Yeah, I love that. Do you have any sort of final tips that, for people that are looking to really knock their story out of the park, designers specifically as well?
I honestly think for designers, like, the story of how you make your customers into the hero, really go back to how what you do makes your customers successful, how it makes them look good, how it helps them tell a better story, how it improves their brand. I think if you can always lead with the customer and how it makes them just awesome, that's the kind of story that's really going to get more confidence, more attention, and pull people to you versus, hey, I really like eating brie cheese on Saturday afternoon.
Love that. Thank you so much, Maggie. There's some really awesome nuggets of wisdom in here that even I'm going to be bringing back to my own process. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Marie.
Where can people find you online?
It's really sophisticated. It's MaggiePatterson.com. That's Patterson with 2 T's. That's where I hang out. That's where I blog. That's where my podcast is. That's where all the things Maggie are. And I tell my little
podcast.
Yeah, all my little snippets of stories are all hanging out over there.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Maggie.
Thank you, guys.
Take care.